Japan has sent a stark warning to Putin. Stop this senseless war or face the consequences. Tokyo has never been a fan of Russia, but this new round of help to Ukraine might have put the final nail in Putin's hope of reconciliation. Japan has always positioned itself as a partner to Ukraine, but now it's showing itself to be a very clear enemy of Russia. With new changes in its internal military policy, Japan is making it clear that it wants to end Russia and the war. Let's first go over Japan's current actions before looking at the rocky history between the two nations. The war has been going on for 2.5 years, but Russia has still been unable to take Ukraine down. The more time it takes to secure victory, then the more time the rest of the world has to back Ukraine up, and things are getting uglier for Putin. At this stage, hundreds of billions of dollars in military aid have been sent to Ukraine, and at the same time, NATO members have begun to rearm themselves to prepare for a possible conflict with Russia. Right from the onset, Japan has been very clear about where it stands. In 2023, Tokyo pledged $5.5 billion in humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Tokyo had previously pledged to send Kiev $600 million in financial assistance and $700 million in humanitarian aid, including medical supplies and food assistance. It also jumped on the strict sanctions bandwagon with all the other Western allies in 2022. On the media front, Japan has used every talking opportunity to show support for Ukraine. Before we dive in, please give this video a like and share our content with your friends. Pushing out geopolitical content isn't always easy, and we're constantly fighting bots that try to downvote our content. Little things such as liking our videos go a long way in keeping our content on your page. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida was quoted saying that Japan was in a position to lead the world's efforts to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia. This is because Japan truly believes that it's the duty of the international community to uphold a free and open international order based on the rule of law. He went on to add that Russia's aggression was not something that the European countries had to deal with, but a matter of global importance. Kishida also hosted an online summit of G7 leaders with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky after the first anniversary of Moscow's invasion and in preparation for the G7 summit in Hiroshima in May. Japan chose Hiroshima as the perfect venue for the summit to remind the powers of the atomic bombing that happened in World War II, and have everyone thinking about how Moscow's invasion of Ukraine was raising alarm bells of potential nuclear war. Kishida again reminded the G7 countries that Russia's actions meant that the threat of nuclear warfare was getting more real, and they needed to push more for nuclear disarmament. Japan did not just show its support in words, and in 2022, Tokyo expelled 9 Russian diplomats after news about mass killings in Bucha, Ukraine emerged. In February 2024, officials from Japan and Ukraine met to discuss a new investment treaty. Prime Minister Kishida held the Japan-Ukraine conference called the Promotion of Economic Growth and Reconstruction in Tokyo. The conference was about discussing how Japan would channel money into Ukraine for its war effort. During those treaty negotiations, Japan reaffirmed its vow to continue providing support to reconstruct Ukraine. A bilateral tax treaty was also created that codified a set of tax rules that would prevent double taxation of companies and individuals. This means that Japanese investors no longer have to worry about being taxed by both Ukraine and Japan. The effect of this is that the increase in investment is going to go into helping Ukraine rebuild. Japan also agreed to ease visa controls and to support Japanese venture capital countries in Ukraine. During his keynote address, the Prime Minister made a lot of good points, so we'll share part of the speech here. The war in Ukraine is still going on at this very moment, and the situation's not easy. The promotion of economic reconstruction, however, is not only investment for the future of Ukraine, but also investing in Japan and the whole globe. We must strive for the future of all of us. Japan, through both the public and private sectors, will provide robust support for economic reconstruction and industrial enhancement that will lead to the economic growth of Ukraine, a country with significant potential. It's our aim to support Ukraine so that the country can achieve comprehensive economic development from the primary to tertiary sectors, including in such key areas as agriculture, manufacturing, and the IT industry. He also continued to explain that this commitment was not a one-time thing, saying, The reconstruction of Ukraine will not be achieved overnight. The solidarity of the international community in this line of effort also needs to be strengthened. We'll work with our partners and international organizations and closely coordinate with the G7 and other countries. We'll make our measures and efforts closely in line with various developments in the international discussion, including an International Ukraine Recovery Conference to be hosted by Germany in coming June. It is the very interest of Japan and the international community as a whole that, overcoming the scars of Russia's aggression, Ukraine realizes its reconstruction and regains its vitality. We sincerely ask for the cooperation of all the participants gathering here for today's conference. After the conference, Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal later posted on social media platform Telegram stating that Japan would create a two-part program through which it would provide $1.35 billion in support to Japanese investors working in Ukraine. He also commented on the tax treaty, claiming that major Japanese car makers such as Toyota and Honda would be able to open factories in Ukraine. After the conference, Japan pledged to provide a further $12 billion in financial assistance. The total of Japan's financial investments has placed it in the top 5 countries in the world providing financial aid to Ukraine. Now, this is big news, but you might not have seen that news because a lot of traditional news organizations are not good at properly covering important geopolitics news. That's why we launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers important geopolitical news in a simplified manner. Every evening, we send out an email directly to your inbox covering important stories that you can read in just a few minutes. Best of all of this is completely free, and you can sign up right now by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code. By continuing to work very closely with Ukraine, Japan is delivering a very clear message to Russia that it's not in support of what it's doing. Prime Minister Kishida has been hard at work, and again on April 11th, he delivered a speech to the US Congress. This opportunity was a big deal because only the closest of US allies get to speak to the Senate and the House. Kishida is also the second Japanese prime minister ever to address a joint meeting, after Shinzo Abe on April 29, 2015. Kishida first began by stroking Washington's ego and stating that the US leading the way on the global stage was indispensable. He also had to be strategic with this speech because there were deep differences in US politics about the role that America should play in the Ukrainian war. He also sympathized with America's position, as it always seemed that the duty to uphold international order always landed on it. In his speech, he said, "The leadership of the United States is indispensable. Without US support, how long before the hopes of Ukraine would collapse under the onslaught from Moscow? Without the presence of the United States, how long before the Indo-Pacific would have to face even harsher realities?" Kishida made sure to end the message with something for Putin, reiterating that Japan would continue to stand with Ukraine in the war.
It has also exported its ballistic missiles to support Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, greatly increasing the suffering of the Ukrainian people.
This 2-year-long media campaign that Japan's been running for Ukraine already communicates that it's against Russia, but things have definitely amped up this year. In June 2024, Ukraine and Japan signed a 10-year security agreement. Up until this point, Japan had not been able to provide military aid because of constitutional constraints that stopped it. Now, after a negotiation and a revision of its guidelines, Tokyo will now be able to indirectly supply Kiev with weapons through the United States. Under this revision, Japan will be exporting Patriot air missiles to the United States to help Washington replenish its weapon stockpiles depleted by its military assistance of Ukraine. For the first time since 2014, this revision will allow the export of finished defense products to countries that hold patents for the equipment. At the same time, Tokyo has made it very clear that the Patriot missiles are for US stocks and not for transfer to a third country. The revised framework allows for license-built military gear to be transferred, but Tokyo has to give its approval first. Masashi Murano, a Japan chair fellow at the US-based Hudson Institute, explained how this benefits Kiev, saying, "If Japan transfers its Patriot PAC-3 missiles to the US and Washington exports the Patriots it already stocks to Ukraine, then this can indirectly support Kiev without affecting US air defense capacity." Japan stepping in to provide military assistance is a clear sign that it's gearing up for war. As if this wasn't enough, Japan will also provide Ukraine with $4.5 billion and will continue to support it through the agreement's entire 10-year term. Zelensky and Kishida have also agreed to set up a bilateral consultation framework to discuss a joint response within 24 hours of Russian armed attacks. Another way that Japan's made its feelings about Russia clear is through economic warfare. At the beginning of the war, Japan was one of the first to coordinate with the US and other G7 countries to implement sanctions. The first round of sanctions included asset freezes, restrictions on SWIFT payment access, and restrictions on the import and export of goods. In April 2022, Japan revoked Russia's most favored nation status alongside the US, UK, and the European Union. This status is a trade policy that gives a country privileged position in international trade and grants it certain benefits. These benefits include lower tariffs, reduced regulatory hurdles, and increased investment. After this, more sanctions came, more asset freezes followed, and more export bans as well. In early 2024, Japan joined the G7 countries in placing a price cap on Russian oil too. Then, in March, April, and June, Japan froze more assets and continued to squeeze Russia financially. We get that Japan wants to help Ukraine, but its exaggerated assistance has a lot to do with the terrible relationship it has with Russia. It's at this stage in the video that we dive into some of the problems that exist between Japan and Russia, and highlight that its support of Ukraine is more than just a belief in international order. The disagreement between the two nations goes back to World War II, when the Soviet Union seized the Kuril Islands, which are just 810 miles northeast of the Japanese island of Hokkaido. Ever since then, there's been hostility between the two nations, but things look like they might have gotten better in the early 2010s. Russia began to engage in talks with Tokyo, and it seemed that it might give the islands back to Japan. Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe spent most of his time trying to improve relationships between Japan and Russia and enable an agreement to be reached. This meant holding many diplomatic talks, joint tourism projects, and even talks about investment and economic development. In early 2019, Shinzo Abe and Vladimir Putin agreed to accelerate negotiations based on the 1956 document between the Soviet Union and Japan. The document stated that the Habomai islets and Shikotan would be handed back to Japan, and the question of Kunoshiri and Etorofu would be settled during negotiations. After such productive conversations, Russia suddenly turned around and began to do its own thing. First, the Kremlin began to steadily increase its military presence in the northern territories, with satellite imagery showing Putin had been building infrastructure on the islands. The most shocking part is that construction comes as close as 14 miles to Hokkaido. In October 2020, Russia began to periodically conduct military drills on the islands and has plans to go further. The Kremlin also has plans to deploy T-72B3 battle tanks to the island so they could be used to destroy enemy forces and small enemy ships. Russia has also deployed S-300 V-4 air defense missile systems to the territory. All of these actions make it clear that Moscow does not intend to hand the islands over. There's also been construction of barracks large enough to host a population of 7,000 on Kunashiri Islands, which justifies Japan's suspicions. The concern for Japan is the proximity to Japanese territory and Russia's continuous disregard for other nations' sovereignty. Russia's partnerships have also become a cause for concern for Japan. As China continues to grow as a global power militarily and economically, Japan's beginning to lose its position as the strongest power in the Indo-Pacific. Russia comes into this situation because of its alliance with China. Both China and Russia threaten the sovereignty of Japan, and now that they're cooperating, Japan's increased its suspicion of Russia. Russia's militarization of the islands also does not give Japan much faith either. What Japan's also afraid of is Russia's actions are paving the way for other ambitious countries like China to follow by invading Taiwan. Tokyo believes that Russia's actions are sending the wrong message, and in a speech given by Kishida in 2022, he said, "The invasion of Ukraine is a challenge that is not confined to Europe. It's a matter of the whole world, including Asia. Japan will work together with other nations and take actions with resolute determination, so that we would not be sending out the wrong message to the international community, so that using force to unilaterally control the status quo shall never be repeated." Although he did not say it directly, it's clear that Kishida was talking about China here. In our discussion, we also need to consider the fact that Japan's actions are not all pure. What Japan's hoping to achieve by supporting Ukraine is the same support in return. If China causes any problems in East Asia, Japan's hoping that Europe and the United States will remember the support it showed here and step in to assist. In the past, Japan's foreign policy used to be passive, but now it's become a lot more active in building global partnerships and influence. Public opinion back home also supports Japan's position, with 77% of the population believing that the international community needs to stop the Russian invasion. Another poll showed that 73.7% of the Japanese support the tough economic sanctions, even if it means that Japan suffers economically. With everything Japan's done so far, the overall approval ratings have also risen, and this is something that benefits Kishida in the long run. On the political front as well, Putin's allies are phasing out. These older politicians were on his side and believed that NATO's responses to Russia were provocative. However, the assassination of Shinzo Abe took away Putin's star ally from him. Abe worked hard to strengthen cooperation between the two countries and often referred to him as Dear Vladimir. Many also believe that his friendship with Putin is what stopped Japan from sanctioning Russia during the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Other former ministers like Yukio Hatoyama and Yoshiro Mori no longer have the influence required to have any real impact on Japanese policy, so they're of no use. The first foreign politician to accept Putin, Muneo Suzuki, has also lost his influence due to his arrest for corruption and being thrown out of his own party. The new generation of politicians led by Prime Minister Kishida is steering the Japanese ship further away from Moscow. Russia's relationship with North Korea has also worked to push Japan away. In June 2024, North Korea and Russia signed a mutual defense pact. In this pact, Kim Jong-un and Putin signed an agreement that had a clause that called for the other nation to step in the case of aggression from other nations. By doing this, Putin has made it clear that he does not want a relationship with Tokyo. This is because North Korea represents a major threat to Japan in the Indo-Pacific, as Japan has strong ties with South Korea. This is why Kishida believes that Russia's problem is not a Europe-only problem, and wants everyone to wake up to this truth. In preparation for a large-scale war, it would be unwise to just focus on strengthening Ukraine without making preparations for your own nation. Currently, Japan is in the top 10 of the countries with global military power, and it's been competitively working to enter the top 5. There have been massive changes in Japan's defense budget under a radical new security strategy that will see the country investing 2% of its gross domestic product in the military over the next 5 years. To ensure a speedy response in times of conflict, the US and Japan have both updated their command and control arrangements. Along with this arrangement, Japan has also announced that they will create a permanent joint headquarters in Japan to allow the two countries to respond accordingly during a conflict. The US is also working towards creating something similar in the Indo-Pacific to help American military forces. Japan's arsenal is also quite advanced, and reports say that it's up to par with that of meganations like the UK and France. In 2023, the Japanese Ministry of Defense paid out $112 million for the purchase of Type 10 main battle tanks. The budget also had provisions for the purchase of the Type 19 self-propelled howitzer, which would be taken out of the 2024 budget. The Type 19 is a very special machine because it was designed with the ability to implement the shoot and scoot tactic. This allows it to rapidly fire and then relocate swiftly during combat. All of these new changes and purchases are a clear indication that Japan's preparing for the negative consequences that might come from assisting Ukraine. Let's also look at what Putin's response to this has been. In the beginning, he probably didn't expect that his invasion of Ukraine would cause such a negative reaction with Japan. After Japan announced that it would be providing its Patriot systems to the US, Russia kicked into gear and responded with the same threats it's been throwing at NATO and the UK. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharov commented on the situation, saying, "The Japanese side loses control over the weapons with which Washington can now do whatever it wants. It cannot be ruled out that under an already tested scheme, Patriot missiles will end up in Ukraine. Such a scenario would be interpreted as unambiguously hostile actions against Russia and will lead to grave consequences for Japan in the context of bilateral relations. If there was ever any hope of Russia and Japan working together again, the war with Ukraine has killed it. Japan is waking up to the realization that Putin's ambition knows no end, and if it's not careful, it could be the next Ukraine. On top of that, Russia's chosen to ally with all of Japan's enemies, making it clear exactly where it stands. The changes in its military policy are communicating that the time has come for countries to meet Putin's aggression with aggression of their own. Until the war ends, Japan will continue to fight with Ukraine, hoping that this will be the end of Russia.